Hi everyone, welcome to today's lesson. It's going to be the first in a series of 3 lessons covering Alla Prima portrait painting. The Alla Prima method is, obviously it's in Italian rather than English, but it basically means that it's a painting completed in one sitting or all at once, so while the paint is completely wet. A lot of painting is based on allowing layers to dry and working over the top, so any kind of glazed approach to painting is indirect, which means that you allow layers to dry and then you apply thinner layers of different colours or different types of layers over the top in order to create different effects. This method of painting is completely direct, so we just work directly onto the canvas or panel, and in Alla Prima it's all one sitting. So I've divided this project into 3 lessons, but it's actually completed in a single sitting. So when you complete your own version of this, I'd like you to watch through all 3 videos so you see how the process works, and then attempt to do it without stopping, basically. It's a useful method if you're working from life and you have a limited amount of time, say you were completing a study for a portrait, or if you were working in a portrait class at a life drawing group that's local to you, and you don't have that much time, you can get everything done in a single sitting with this approach. So you can work from life, either a sitter, so someone you know, or if you were working in a class, or you can work from yourself in a mirror, so it would be a self-portrait, or you can work from a photo reference. Today I'm going to be working from a photo reference, reasonably loosely, just a picture on an iPad that I found, fairly kind of generic portrait photograph. If you are working from a reference, be aware that a lot of portrait photography is quite different from the sort of lighting that they'll use is quite different from what you would ideally want in a portrait. So I've picked some quite natural light with this piece I'm working as a reference. You can do stuff with different types of lights, so pretty much anything will work, but some types of lighting, maybe 3-point lighting that they use in photography, can be a bit tricky because it's difficult to tell what competing light sources are doing what to the portrait, and this approach is based on having quite a distinct set of shadows and lights, which is very often the way that I teach drawing and painting, particularly early on. So that covers our subject. The materials that I'm using, I've got a small white canvas. It's actually a sort of canvas panel. This one's 8 by 10 inches. I'd recommend no bigger than this for your first attempt at it, just because the bigger it gets, the more complicated it is and the more paint you need, the messier it can be, and it just becomes a bit overwhelming if you're trying to do everything in one sitting of say 2 or 3 hours, something like that. So the smaller it is, the more manageable it becomes. Then you need a palette, so I've just got a handheld palette, and I'll go through the paints that I'm using. It's a reasonably limited palette. You can actually limit your palette even more than this. But I'm going to be using titanium white. I recommend, as always, getting decent quality brands if possible. So I've got a big tube of titanium white that I'm working with. If it ever focuses. Then I've got CAD red and CAD yellow, high chroma reds and yellows. And I'm going to be using burnt umber and yellow ochre. So burnt umber is a kind of brownish or kind of a grey red, dark grey red, and then CAD yellow. This is French yellow ochre, which is a kind of a browny yellow. So these are my low chroma versions of the red and the yellow. So they'll appear more in the halftones, and these will appear more in the lights or bits of the shadows that need to be high chroma. And finally, I'm using ivory black as my black. So this can be used to grey things down, or for sections that need just a pure black. But that's pretty much it. So it's just a six colour palette, which is reasonably simple. As I say, you can actually limit it even more by omitting burnt umber and cadmium yellow. So there is a thing called the Underzone palette, which, just going to squeeze some paint out. Underzone was a Swedish painter from the 19th century, and he has this famous famously simple portrait or figure palette for interior work, where the light is quite kind of minimal and naturalistic. And he just used white, black, ivory black, which doubles as a blue. And then he used a reasonably strong yellow ochre and cadmium red. The cadmium red and yellow ochre and white gave him his light flesh tones, and then he mixed the black in to get his darker flesh tones and shadows. So it is manageable to do it with such a limited palette, but can be a bit tricky if you're a beginner. Just about done stringing all my paints out. Make sure you put a reasonable amount of paint out on your palette. You don't want to have to be constantly adding paint or feeling like you shouldn't use any because you've got too much, that sort of thing. That's all my paint up. And then you'll need an easel. So I've got this quite big easel in my studio that I'm working from. You also want a palette cup, some kind of container for your mineral spirits, and then just mineral spirits in your palette cup, because it's just a single sitting, you don't really need oil. Then a selection of brushes, and I give specific measurements in the document, but so you want some that are round and some that are flat, if possible. And you want a mixture of kind of, say, 4mm wide, or even smaller, maybe 2mm wide, up to about 2 centimeters. So this is a selection I'm using, about 5 brushes. You don't want loads of brushes because it starts to get a bit confusing and you forget what brush has what colour on it and so on. And finally you want some kind of kitchen towel or rag for cleaning your brushes and wiping back. So I'm just going to go get some kitchen towel quickly. And I've also got a dirty rag if I need it for cleaning brushes. And we're going to begin with, we're going to take our biggest brush and do a very thin wash of yellow ochre over the whole piece. You can do this in advance and let it dry, which means you don't have so much issue with things mixing in. But if you're just working, say you have a white canvas and you weren't expecting to have to work, you can do it this way. So you can see it's going on pretty thinly. And this basically just provides a tone to work on, so we're not working straight over white, because it can be difficult, as I've said in previous lessons. So something like that should work. A little bit more, make sure we've got just enough space. So yeah, that'll do. Drop my brush behind there. The other way that you can apply that is you can get a rag or a kitchen towel and kind of squeeze some paint out and then rub it over with a mineral spirits, but this works completely fine. And the next thing we're going to do is use a reasonably stiff, reasonably small brush to begin sketching in the major shapes of the head and also the major shadow shapes. We're going to do this in burnt umber. So what I usually do is, you can use a little bit of mineral spirits or just kind of use a dry brush. I'm going to begin just by marking something for the top of where the head will go. And then position my reference in a usable place. Something for the chin, kind of general direction of the chin. basically just trying to figure out the general size of the head as we want it. Go down to the neck. So yeah, something like that's not too bad. You could make it bigger. As I say, for the sake of something being manageable, the smaller that it is, the easier you'll tend to find it. So we're going to keep it about this size, I think, for today. So I've just got his collar, the top of his jumper drawn in there. It kind of angles back up a bit. Drops down. You'll notice I'm holding the brush quite far back as I work. Just kind of keeps things loose. The idea of this particular kind of approach to painting is you don't want stuff to get too fussy. So don't worry too much about correcting things, rubbing stuff back. That's kind of part of the process and tends to add to the charm of the piece as well. So, in that it's a sketch, and the idea is that you'll complete it pretty quickly. You don't have to get too hung up on specifics of accuracy and that sort of thing. So now that I've kind of roughly blocked in the general size of the head, I'm kind of thinking about compositionally where I want it to be inside the rest of the piece. So I've given it a bit of room around the outside. I can now begin blocking in the major shadow shapes just using a line drawing. So it shouldn't take too long to do this. You kind of want it to be a reasonably quick part of the process. So the first kind of major dark shape in the piece is this jumper, which kind of drops down there as we saw before. A little bit of hair that kind of overlaps that corner of the jumper, so we'll leave room for that. That's just kind of dropping straight down. Now the next shadow shape we're going to look for is the underside of the jaw, which then casts the shadow down onto the neck. So again, it's all very loose. This I'm trying to use fairly straight lines as I block all my shapes in. So I'll drop that there, and we've got top of the forehead here. Side of the face that drops down, and shadow shape that drops down into here. A little bit of the hair that flicks back, sort of shadow shape. So adding these shadow shapes around the edge of this face starts to kind of define it. Portion of hair there comes up, wraps around, drops back down. Try to keep it reasonably blocky. And there's these shapes here. Some more shapes up in the hair. Straight back down side of the face. Shape back there. and we've got a line that comes across here. You can block in just as a line across the whole face, roughly where the brow is. Then kind of in the middle of that and the bottom of the chin is roughly where the nose is. You can block that in just as a little line. And then finally, slightly higher in the centre there, we've got a mouth that cuts through. It's a little bit shorter than that. So from that shape of the nose, we can kind of smudge something in there, and then start blocking in some general shapes for the eyes, which are kind of half in shadow. Drop down there, and a little shape that cuts across. And then that can lead us to correct a few other things. Yeah, then drops down a little bit further. So now we've roughly got that as a line drawing in place, we can fill in any of the, using a little bit more burnt umber, swapping to a slightly bigger brush, or a wider brush. We can start blocking in the masses for any of the shadows, so pretty much all this side of the hair was in shadow, so I'm going to drop that down a bit. You want to try to use as broad strokes as you can when you're doing this sort of stuff. Can redefine some of these shapes in the eyes. This is a little area we'll definitely be going back to revisit, as that's where a lot of the character comes from. But for now we're just going to block these in as kind of general shapes. Okay, block in this shadow underneath the chin. So it connects up there. Some of these little flecks of shadow in the hair, got that shadow behind. Another little shadow underneath that lip. A few shadows in this ear. Shadows dropping down into those bits of the hair. And we can just to make it distinct, patch in this jumper, which will probably ultimately end up a black colour. It is in the reference. But that's it, pretty much masked in, blocked in. So from there we can now move into creating variety within the darks. So this will be the last portion of this aspect of the project. And you can do this as a pretty quick step before you start working in the lights. But there are going to be certain little sections within these shadows, as always, that are darker than others. And so we'll begin with adding the darkest darks, which I'm going to add just as blacks. So we've got some little dark notes here underneath the hair, and you can kind of add these pretty much opaquely where they're necessary. Got another little notch in there. Got some bits here where the jumper's connecting with the hair. Probably I might just go over and darken the whole jumper as well, because it's going to end up pretty much black by the end. So this will make it a kind of grey black, but it should be an alright colour. Most of these darker notes occur around the portions of the hair that are kind of not catching any direct light. Another little one behind this ear. Starts to give it a bit more specific shape. So again, still just working with black while I'm doing this. Note that's should be a little bit further back. So pretty much we've got those darker sections in. I might just extend this jumper slightly. That looks a bit better. And we could go in and reinforce black in this jumper, or at least create some kind of sense of form with it, but that will probably roughly do. So I'm starting to not quite have enough room for detail using that bigger brush, but I want to go in and keep adding some variety to these shadows. So for this jawline, I'm just going to swap to a smaller brush here. And just want to reinforce bedbug line. It's kind of division between the shadow and the light there. And where else do I need a bit more detail? Probably just here, looking at that ear. Something like that. That's not too bad. Can also add some slightly more specific shapes and values for these eyebrows. Try not to get too detailed, that's something we'll do a bit later. But at the same time I do want to have enough information there that drop a suggestion of those eyes, which might actually go a little bit bluer, but we'll leave that for a little while. And can also find some darker notes down in that nose, and at the same time start adding some lighter sections. So there's a bit of reflected light that bounces up into the bottom of the nose, which means it can actually be quite light relatively. Just go back and fine it a bit. You don't have to worry too much about getting your shapes exactly right at this point, just because you're going to be working back with the lights over the darker shapes. But you do want to try to get the colours and the values roughly right if possible. I might use that same reflected light just here underneath the brow, and also use it to start kind of tapering up slightly. Just looking for that reflected light underneath the jaw, or kind of underneath the neck and jaw. Just going to be a bit higher chroma. So you generally want to follow the principle that within each distinct section, so within the lights and the darks, the lighter sections will be higher chroma as a general rule. That'll pretty much do it for our darks in this one. There's not actually a huge amount of variety within the darks for the time being. I think we might find some more as we start to refine the lights in the next stage. But as far as we're going with this, this should be sufficient. Once the lights are in, we'll be able to make some slightly better decisions about the darks, I think. Just going to add a little bit more red into those ears. And I might just go back to that nose and add those nostrils, because you'll pretty much always find the nostrils have these dark little notes under them. And we're going to refine that shape of that nose a bit as well, I think. Once we get into the light, probably afterwards, do a little bit more. But that's pretty much it for this stage. The last thing I could possibly do is add a slightly more red shadow just underneath this mouth here. And at the same time, actually, I'm going to raise it. So yeah, something like that. Pretty much where we're going to leave it for today. Well, for this session at least. And then next week we'll be carrying on and starting to work on the halftones and create some form in the face. But you can see pretty much as far as kind of character goes with the face, we're kind of getting there already. And it creates quite a nice effect, so it's a nice way to work. Even if you left it at this stage, you could be reasonably happy with it as an overall piece for half an hour's work. But yeah, hopefully that's interesting, and I'll see you guys next week.